Well, hello, my name is Sean, and welcome back to the Berean Way, a channel where we strive to be as the Bereans, searching the Scriptures daily in pursuit of genuine biblical truth. And so welcome back, friends, to the channel. This is Part D, the final installment of our teaching on the Forgotten Calendar, which is Part 6 of our series, New Cart Christianity, Why We Must Test Everything. Parts A, B, and C are all in the playlist linked in the description, and we strongly encourage you to watch those first if you haven't already. Now, the foundation, it's there. The scriptural proofs, they're there, and the apostolic witnesses and the objections are addressed in those teachings. And today, we're going to complete the picture with the historical record and the testing framework's final verdict, so let's get into this. Now, we're in the middle, as we said, of our series, New Cart Christianity, Why We Must Test Everything. And this is the fourth and the final part of our teaching on the Forgotten Calendar. And so if you're joining us for the first time today, again, that full series playlist, it's in the description below, and we would just strongly encourage you to start at the very beginning. Now, in parts A through C, we establish from the Word of Yahweh itself that the biblical calendar is luni-solar, that the Sabbaths fall on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th days of the lunar month. The new moon day, that it stands outside the weekly cycle and is its own sacred category, and that this pattern is confirmed by multiple witnesses from both the Hebrew Scriptures and the apostolic writings. And we addressed the most common objections, and we examined the Jericho and the Aphek accounts, and we worked through the apparent exceptions of Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur. And so today we're going to turn to the historical record, the external confirmation from both Jewish and secular scholarship, and then we're going to apply the full testing framework to the specific question of the modern church's calendar. And we close where every teaching in this series has closed, with the call of Yahweh to stand at the crossroads and to find the ancient path and to walk in that. So let's begin. Now, the prophet Daniel, writing centuries before the birth of Yeshua, he prophesied something specific about a power that would arise and would oppose the people of Yahweh. Daniel 7:25 tells us, and it speaks words against the Most High, and it wears out the set-apart ones of the Most High, and it intends to change appointed times and laws, and they are given into its hand for a time and times and half a time. Now notice that phrase, intends to change appointed times and law. Now the Aramaic word for appointed times here is the equivalent of the Hebrew moedim. In other words, the appointed times of Yahweh. And so the prophetic vision identifies the changing of Yahweh's appointed times as one of those signature acts of this power that would arise to persecute Yahweh's people and oppose His kingdom. And so when we survey the historical landscape of the last 2,000 years, what we find is this prophecy's been fulfilled, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, incremental, culturally normalized replacement of Yahweh's sacred calendar with the calendar of Rome. And so the historical evidence that we're about to examine is not the primary evidence. Scripture is the primary evidence, and we've already established the scriptural case across parts A, B, and C in this series. But the historical evidence, we believe, is important for two reasons. First, it demonstrates that what we have discovered from Scripture is not some modern invention. It was recognized by scholars across multiple traditions who have no theological stake in the luni-solar calendar at all. And secondly, we believe it documents the specific historical forces that produce the departure from Yahweh's calendar. These forces that can be named, dated, and even held accountable to the testing framework. Now let's begin with the historical evidence for the luni-solar calendar. Now, Scripture, as always, is our primary and authoritative witness, but Yahweh, friend, He's very gracious, and He's not left us without some external confirmation. Now, the historical record from Jewish encyclopedias, secular historians, early church sources, and scholarly reference works provides a very remarkable body of testimony supporting what the biblical text already demonstrates. So let's begin with the testimony of Jewish and secular scholarship. So we're going to begin here with the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, which says, and I quote, Sabbath and new moon, or Rosh Chodesh, both periodically recurring in the course of the year. The new moon is still, and the Sabbath originally was, dependent upon the lunar cycle, end of quote. This is the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, page 410. And notice the language. The Sabbath, quote, originally was, dependent upon the lunar cycle. And so this is a Jewish source acknowledging that the Sabbath in its original form was lunar, and what was observed as the Gregorian Saturday Sabbath is a later development. Now, the popular and critical Bible Encyclopedia adds this, quote, among all early nations, the lunar months were the readiest large divisions of time. In order to connect the reckoning by weeks with the lunar month, we find that all ancient nations observed some peculiar solemnities to mark the day of the new moon, end of quote. This is volume 3, page 1497. Now, we also have a reference in the Encyclopedia Biblica, which is equally direct, where it says, quote, each lunar month was divided into 4 parts, corresponding to the 4 phases of the moon. The first week of each month began with the new moon, so that as the lunar month was 1 or 2 days more than 4 periods of 7 days, these additional days were not reckoned at all, end of quote. And that's on page 5290. Notice that phrase, not reckoned at all. In other words, the extra days at the month's beginning and end, the new moon days, were not counted as part of the weekly cycle. And this is precisely the structure, friend, that we've been demonstrating from the biblical text itself. Now, another witness is found in Hutton Webster's work, his scholarly work titled Rest Days. He wrote, and I quote, the early Hebrews employed lunar 7-day weeks, which ended with special observances on the 7th day, but nonetheless were tied to the moon's course, and it is most significant that in the older parts of the Hebrew Scriptures, the new moon and the Sabbath are almost invariably mentioned together, end of quote. Even Scribner's Dictionary of the Bible confirms this when it says, and I quote, in the time of the earliest prophets, the new moon stood in the same line with another lunar observance, the Sabbath. Ezekiel describes the gate of the inner court of the temple looking eastward as kept shut for 6 working days, but opened on the Sabbath and the new moon, end of quote. That's on page 521. And the Jewish Encyclopedia states, and I quote, the Sabbath, depending in Israel's nomadic period upon the observance of the phases of the moon, could not, according to this view, be a fixed day, end of quote. And so what this means is that the Sabbath could not be a fixed day on the solar calendar. It was fixed on the lunar calendar, always the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th day, but never anchored to a particular day of the Gregorian week. Now, the Encyclopedia Biblica delivers what is perhaps the most sobering summary here when it says, quote, the introduction of the custom of celebrating the Sabbath every 7th day, irrespective of the relationship of the day to the moon's phases, led to a complete separation from the ancient view of the Sabbath, end of quote. And this is on page 4179. And so, friend, the evidence is not in dispute even among serious scholars. The original Hebrew Sabbath was lunar. It was, quote, originally dependent upon the lunar cycle, end of quote, as we just read. The separation from the lunar calendar, it was a complete separation from the ancient view. And these are not advocates of the luni-solar calendar making these statements. These are mainstream reference works of Jewish and secular scholarship, writing without theological stake in the question at all, and they confirm what the biblical text already demonstrates. But let's look at a first-century witness here, Philo of Alexandria. Now, Philo of Alexandria, he lived and wrote during the New Testament era, a Jewish philosopher and scholar contemporary with Yeshua himself and the early apostolic community. And his testimony, it provides a first-century witness to the moon's governing role in the calendar. Here's what Philo had to say, quote, the moon receives the perfect shapes in periods of 7 days. The half moon in the first 7-day period after its conjunction with the sun, full moon in the second, end of quote. And this comes from the works of Philo in his book, The Special Laws, page 550. And I think that's book 1. Now, Philo describes the moon's phases in terms of 7-day periods beginning from the conjunction. In other words, the dark phase, the new moon, if you will. And the conjunction, it's the starting point of the count. And this confirms the dark phase model of the new moon that we established from 1 Samuel 20, and it places the testimony of the first century Jewish intellectual alongside the biblical and scholarly evidence for the luni-solar calendar. So let's now continue by asking, when and how did the calendar change? So, having established that the original Hebrew Sabbath was lunar and that the separation from the lunar calendar was a later development, the historical question demands to be asked, when did this change occur and what was it that drove it? The evidence points to a gradual process that was driven by identifiable historical forces, none of which were Yahweh's command. So let's begin here by looking at Julius Caesar and the abandonment of the lunar reckoning in 46 BCE. Now, the new Encyclopedia Britannica documents the origins of the Gregorian calendar system, and it says, quote, "The origin of the calendric system in general use today, the Gregorian calendar, can be traced back to the Roman Republican calendar. By 46 BCE, the calendar had become so hopelessly confused that Julius Caesar was forced to initiate a reform of the entire system. Caesar invited the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes to undertake the task. Sosigenes suggested abandoning the lunar system altogether and replacing it with a tropical year of 365.25 days. The adoption of such reformatory measures resulted in the establishment of the Julian calendar, which was used for roughly the next 1600 years." End of quote. Now, in 46 BCE, Julius Caesar decreed that the Roman calendar would abandon the lunar system entirely. And the months of the Julian calendar, they no longer corresponded to the phases of the moon. They were purely arbitrary solar divisions. And this was the calendar that the Roman culture and eventually Roman Christianity adopted as its standard. And the Creator ordained the moon to regulate the months and the appointed times. Caesar decreed otherwise. And then Daniel 7:25 echoes, quote, "He intends to change appointed times and law." But let's move on and let's look at Rome's 8-day week at the time of Yeshua. Because here's a historical fact that most Christians have never even encountered. At the time of Yeshua, Rome operated an 8-day market week, not a 7-day week. The Roman Republican calendar used an 8-day cycle represented by letters A through H. And those who want to find the creation Sabbath on the Roman calendar of the first century are really searching in vain. Rome did not have a 7-day week. It was only later, through the influence of the astrological planetary week that spread from Babylon through the Roman world, that a 7-day system began to displace Rome's 8-day market cycle. And that process was not completed until Constantine. But let's move on. Let's look at another example here, and that is the Bar Kokhba revolt and the displacement of the Nazarene community in 135 CE. And so in 135 CE, following the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Roman Emperor Hadrian expelled all Jewish residents from Jerusalem, and he renamed the city Aelia Capitolina, the legitimate Nazarene successors to the Jerusalem community, what David Clark's article on the Shawi calendar calls the bishops of the circumcision, were displaced from Jerusalem. Clark documents, quote, "This original Nazarene luni-solar calendar was supplanted by a Roman planetary week and calendar in 135 CE. This began a 300-year controversy concerning the true calendar and correct Sabbath," end of quote. So the expulsion of the Hebrew followers of Yeshua from Jerusalem was the moment when Gentile leadership aligned with Roman custom took over the Jerusalem community. And so the luni-solar calendar, which had been the calendar of the original Nazarene believers, was displaced. And the 300-year controversy that followed documents that this was not a smooth or universally accepted transition. People knew something had been lost, and the controversy over the true calendar and correct Sabbath, it lasted 3 centuries. So let's move on here and let's look at Constantine and the institutionalization of the planetary week in 321 CE. Now, before Constantine's edict, Rome's civic rhythm had ran on an 8-day market cycle, the nundinal cycle, not a 7-day week of any kind, biblical or otherwise. And so the 7-day planetary week, each day ruled by, one of the 7 visible wonders, planets, if you will, of the ancient sky: Saturn, Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus. They all entered the Roman life gradually over the first 3 centuries CE, spreading up from Hellenistic astrology rather than being handed down as settled Roman tradition. And so from its very first appearance, this was a perpetual cycle. And so unlike a lunar reckoning anchored in the new moon, the planetary week simply just counted forward day after day with no monthly reset point built into it at all. And so the astrological logic behind its ordering, preserved by the Roman historian Dio Cassius, it mapped the 7 planets onto the 24 hours of the day and then eventually onto all 168 hours of the week. And when that math is worked out, the resulting sequence of day rulers runs from Saturn to Venus, meaning Saturn's day stood first in the pagan astrological system, with Sunday falling second. And friend, that's an important distinction here. So whichever day of it ended up, quote, first, was always going to be an internal man-made question. The entire structure was already a different animal from a moon-anchored week before Constantine ever touched it. And what Saturday actually inherits from Constantine then is not simply a wrong position in the week, it's the wrong kind of week. Genesis ties the Sabbath to a cycle that resets with the new moon so that the 7th day is always reckoned from a fixed monthly anchor point, not carried indefinitely from some ancient starting ordinance. Rome's planetary week did just the opposite. And once Constantine fixed it into law in 321 CE, it became a self-perpetuating cycle, running independent of any lunar reference point, indifferent to the new moon month or season, a mechanism that was built to never reset. And that is precisely what makes it foreign to the creation pattern rather than a continuation of it. And so a Gregorian Saturday, it may occasionally fall on, an 8th or a 15th in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th month, whatever, but the alignment, it's purely accidental, not structural. Most months, it will not. And Saturday keepers are not therefore preserving the 7th day of Yahweh's calendar and merely losing an argument about which day that is. They're keeping a day generated by a different calendar altogether, one whose only claim to continuity is a Roman emperor's decision to stop letting the week reset. And so let's move on. Let's look at the Gregorian reform as found in 1582 CE. So 1600 years later, after Caesar's Julian calendar was established, the accumulated error between the Julian year and the actual solar year had grown by 10 full days. And the new Encyclopedia Britannica records this, quote, in 1572, Pope Gregory XIII agreed to issue a papal bull drawn up by the Jesuit astronomer Christopher Clavius. 10 years later, when the edict was finally proclaimed, 10 days in October were skipped to bring the calendar back in line. So Thursday, October the 4th, 1582, was followed by Friday, October the 15th. And so the calendar that most of the world and really most of Christianity uses today was given to us by a Jesuit astronomer acting under the authority of Pope Gregory XIII. And this is the calendar named after the Pope. This is the calendar that the modern church uses to regulate its religious life. And it has no connection whatsoever to the luni-solar framework that Yahweh declared in Genesis 1:14 as the governing instrument of his appointed times. But moving on, let's look at the pagan names even that are embedded into this calendar. The human fingerprints on the modern Gregorian calendar, they go even deeper than the structural changes. The very names of the days and months bear witness to the pagan origins of the system that modern Christianity has adopted as its religious framework. The months, they go as follows. January is named for Janus, the Roman god of doorways and beginnings. March is named for Mars, the Roman god of war. May is for Maia, the Roman goddess of spring. And June is for Juno, the Roman goddess of marriage. And July and August were named in honor of Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, who were in, Roman imperial theology elevated to divine status. And by the way, this is why those months have 31 days, because the emperors didn't want their days to have less days than the others, since they were believed to be deities themselves. And so 6 of the 12 months are named directly for pagan deities or deified emperors. And even the days carry pagan names. Sunday is named for the sun, Monday for the moon, Tuesday for Tu, or the Norse god of war. Wednesday is named for Woden, or most commonly known as Odin, the Celtic god of wisdom. Thursday for Thor, the Celtic god of thunder. And Friday for Freya, the Celtic goddess of fertility. And Saturday for Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture. And so every single day of the week is named after a pagan deity or a celestial body associated with pagan worship. And this is the calendar that the modern church uses to mark Yahweh's sacred appointments. And the testing framework, friend, simply cannot overlook this. So let's continue by looking at the testing framework's verdict, asking the question, is the Gregorian calendar the church's new cart? So we have now established from the word of Yahweh and from the historical record that the biblical calendar is luni-solar, that the Sabbath falls on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th days of the lunar month, and that the new moon is a distinct category of day outside the weekly cycle, and that the shift from the luni-solar calendar to the continuous Gregorian 7-day cycle was driven by the Roman Empire, Constantine's edicts, the Council of Nicaea, and the Jesuit astronomer, not by the word of Yahweh. And so the testing framework demands that we now ask a decisive question, the written word test: who authorized this? Now, the first and most foundational question the testing framework asks is, where in the word of Yahweh is this change authorized? Now, when we ask the question of the Gregorian calendar as the governing framework of the Christian religious life, the silence is total. There is no text in the Hebrew scriptures or the apostolic writings that authorizes the replacement of the luni-solar calendar with a solar calendar derived from Rome. There's no verse in which Yahweh says, the moon that I appointed to govern my Moedim can now be disregarded in favor of a calendar that was constructed by a Greek astronomer at Julius Caesar's request. There's no apostolic command that shifts the sacred calendar from the lunar framework of creation to the planetary week of Constantine. None exist. The scripture tells us in Deuteronomy 4:2, do not add to the word which I command you, and do not take away from it, so as to guard the commands of Yahweh, your Elohim, which I am commanding you. Deuteronomy 12, verses 30 and 32 reinforce this, where Yahweh says, be careful not to be ensnared by them after they have been destroyed before you. Do not inquire about their gods or their Elohims, saying, how did these nations worship their Elohim? I'll do the same. You must not do the same to Yahweh your Elohim, because they practice every detestable thing which Yahweh hates when worshiping their Elohim or their gods. You must be careful to do everything I commanded you. Do not add anything to it or take away from it. And so the command, friend, it's very clear. Do not take the religious framework of the surrounding nations and apply it to the worship of Yahweh. And the adoption of this Roman Gregorian calendar as the framework for, our religious practice and life is precisely that, the incorporation of a pagan Roman timekeeping structure into the worship of Yahweh. And the church didn't ask, what does Yahweh say about how to mark time? It basically asked, what does Rome do? And then it did the same. The written word test fails the Gregorian calendar. There is no authorization, and there never was. So let's now move on and look at the messianic plumb line. How did Yeshua observe time? So this Messianic plumb line, it asks, what did Yeshua the Messiah do? You may remember the old bracelets, WWJD, what did Jesus do? So we're asking, what did the Messiah do? He observed Passover. We know that from Matthew 26, verses 17 through 19. We know he kept the Feast of Tabernacles, according to John 7 and 2 and verses 10 and 14. We know he taught in the synagogue on the Sabbath, as was his custom, according to Luke 4:16. We know he traveled to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage feast, and every sacred observance of Yeshua's life was organized around the luni-solar calendar of Yahweh, the Moedim of Leviticus 23, timed according to the lunar months that Yahweh ordained in Genesis 1 and 14. And there is not a single instance in any of the Gospels of Yeshua organizing his religious life according to the Roman solar calendar. Luke 4:16 says, "And he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And according to his practice, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read." Notice that phrase, according to his practice. The Sabbath observance of Yeshua was not incidental. It was habitual. And the Sabbath that he observed was the Sabbath of the biblical luni-solar calendar, the Sabbath that, as we have now demonstrated from multiple witnesses, falls on the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th days of the lunar month. And if we are followers of Yeshua the Messiah, the most basic question we can ask about our religious practice is simply this: did Yeshua do this? And Yeshua did not organize his life according to the Gregorian calendar. He organized it according to the word of Yahweh. But let's move on and let's look at Daniel's prophecy and the new cart verdict here. Now, Daniel 7:25 says, "And it speaks words against the Most High, and it wears out the set-apart ones of the Most High, and it intends to change appointed times and law, and they are given into his hand for a time and times and half a time." And so the prophetic vision of Daniel 7:25 identifies the changing of the appointed times as one of the signature acts of this power that would oppose Yahweh's kingdom. And the historical record bears out the fulfillment of this prophecy with great precision, friend. The Roman ecclesiastical powers of the 4th and subsequent centuries, they systematically changed Yahweh's appointed times, from the Moedim to Christmas and Easter, and from the luni-solar Sabbath to the Roman Sunday, from the lunar month to this Gregorian month. And so the verdict of the testing framework, friend, here, it's not ambiguous at all. The Gregorian Roman calendar as the governing framework of Christian religious life is a new cart. It's human, man-made. It was constructed by Julius Caesar and a Greek astronomer. It was reformed by a Jesuit astronomer under papal authority, and it was institutionalized by Constantine's imperial edicts. It carries the names of pagan deities in its months and days, and it has no authorization whatsoever from the word of Yahweh as the framework for observing the sacred appointments of Yahweh's covenant calendar. And the ark of Yahweh's sacred time, his Moedim, his Sabbath, his new moons, his rhythm of worship and rest and holy assembly, it was designed to be carried on the luni-solar shoulders of creation itself. It cannot be safely carried on the Ark of Rome, this new cart calendar. So let's now look at the call to the ancient path, what faithfulness actually looks like. So in everything that we've examined across all 4 parts of this teaching is true, and we believe the evidence from Scripture and from history has demonstrated that it is. Then the question that cannot be avoided is this: what do we do about it? So the testing framework doesn't merely identify new carts, but it calls Yahweh's people to return to the ancient paths. And so to return to the ancient path, we must start with the word, not the tradition. So the first step is the Berean step. The Bereans of Acts 17, they did not simply accept what Paul taught because Paul was, persuasive, credentialed, or even by the fact that he was an apostle. They went to the Scriptures. They searched daily, and they examined what they were being taught against the word of Yahweh. Now, Acts 17:11, a verse that this channel is very familiar with and is founded upon, says, "Now these were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, who received the word with great eagerness, examining the Scriptures every day to see whether these things were so." And so we're asking you to just simply do the same with what you have heard across these four teachings. Not to just take our word for it, and not to just immediately restructure your entire life on the basis of a YouTube series, but to go to the Scriptures. Open Genesis 1:14. Read Psalm 104 and verse 19. Trace the timeline through Exodus chapters 12, 16, and 19. Follow the Sukkot chronology in John chapters 7 through 9. Work through the Acts 20 calculation and let the word speak for itself, because what we have presented here, it's not our invention. It is the testimony we believe of Scripture, laid out plainly for anyone willing to look with honest eyes. But let's now talk about pursuing understanding before performance. And so one of the most important principles that we want to leave you with is this, that understanding must precede performance. Now, the biblical calendar is not a simple matter to navigate, not because Yahweh made it complicated, but because 16 centuries of Roman influence have created a significant gap between where most believers live and where the Word of Yahweh calls them. And so bridging that gap, friend, it takes time, it takes study, much prayer, and even a community of believers. And we also want to be transparent here. The luni-solar calendar we have presented across these teachings is our studied understanding of what Scripture teaches on this question. And we've done our best to present the biblical and historical evidence as faithfully as we know how. But we also want to acknowledge with the humility that the Berean pattern requires that we could be wrong in some details. And what matters is that your heart is oriented toward Yahweh's truth, and that you're willing to bring every tradition, including the calendar you have observed your entire life, to the testing framework, and that you follow the evidence wherever it may lead. The Scripture tells us in Hebrews 11 and 6, "But without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he who comes to Elohim must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him." And so the pursuit of Yahweh's truth in the matter of the calendar is not a legalistic exercise in religious performance. It is an act of love toward the one who wrote His timekeeping into the fabric of creation and said, "These are my appointed times." And when He says mine, He means it. And when we love Him, we want to show up at His appointments at the time He actually set them. And so our conclusion is that we must walk in the ancient path. Jeremiah 6:16, a verse that we've gone over tremendously throughout this last two series that we've done. Jeremiah 6:16, "Thus said Yahweh, stand in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths, where the good way is, and walk in it, and find rest for your beings. But they said," notice these words, "we do not walk in it." And the call of Yahweh through Jeremiah is the call that rings through every teaching in this series. Stand at the crossroads, look for the ancient paths, and ask where the good way is, and walk in it. And the ancient path of Yahweh's timekeeping was written into the heavens from the very first day of creation. It was confirmed in the wilderness by the manna. It was embedded into the Moedim of Leviticus 23. And it was demonstrated, we believe, in the life and ministry of Yeshua the Messiah Himself. And it was documented by both Jewish and secular historians who had no theological stake in affirming it. And it was deliberately changed by Rome, by Constantine, the Council of Nicaea, and a Jesuit astronomer, not by Yahweh Himself. And so the ancient path, friend, it's still there. Yahweh wrote it into the heavens where no human hand could erase it. Every new moon still rises. Every Sabbath of the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th still arrives as it has since creation. And the question Yahweh asked His people in Jeremiah's day and in ours is the same. Will you walk in it? Or will you say, as Israel said in Jeremiah's day, "We do not walk in it"? And the tragedy of Israel in Jeremiah's day was not that they could not find the ancient path. It was that they found it and chose not to walk in it purposely. So may we be a generation, friend, that gives a different answer and says yes to Yahweh's ways. So let's begin to wind this down. Now, we close these 4 teachings on the forgotten calendar with a word of both conviction and grace. And the conviction comes from the word of Yahweh, which is not ambiguous on the question of his calendar. He wrote it into creation. He commanded it in his Torah. He confirmed it through his prophets. He demonstrated it in the life of his son. And he prophesied through Daniel that it would be changed, not by his authority, but by a power that would, quote, intend to change the appointed times and law. And that prophecy, friend, was fulfilled. That change was made. And the testing framework demands that we acknowledge it honestly and that we respond faithfully. But the grace comes from knowing that Yahweh is patient with his people and that he leads us into truth, sometimes progressively, and that he doesn't despise the small beginnings. And so if this is the first time that you're hearing these things, then we would encourage you to take the time that you need. Take these questions to the Word. Take them to prayer. Take them to a community of believers who are really willing to test everything. And what matters is not that you immediately restructure your entire life. What matters is that you're willing to ask the question, that you're willing to let the Word of Yahweh say what it actually says, and that you have the courage of the Bereans to examine the Scriptures daily to see whether these things are so. And so the calendar of Yahweh is written into the heavens where no Caesar, no Pope, no Jesuit astronomer could ever reach it. And the new moon, friend, it still rises. The ancient Sabbaths of the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th, they still arrive. And Yahweh, friend, has not abandoned his calendar. The question he is asking each of us is the question he has always asked his people: will you walk in it? Now, across all 4 parts of the Forgotten Calendar series, we've established the following. First, that the Word of Yahweh declares from Genesis 1:14, Psalm 104 verse 19, and Jeremiah 31 verses 35 through 36, that the moon was created and ordained as the governing instrument of Yahweh's appointed times. And this is not a human interpretation. It is the explicit and direct testimony of Scripture. Second, the biblical calendar recognizes 3 distinct categories of days: work days, Sabbaths, and new moon days, confirmed by 5 witnesses. We looked at Ezekiel 46, Isaiah 66, 2 Kings 4, Amos 8, and 1 Samuel 20. Thirdly, that the weekly Sabbath falls on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th days of the lunar month, as demonstrated by multiple witnesses here. The manna narrative in Exodus 16, the Exodus from Egypt in Numbers 33 and verse 3 and Leviticus 23, 6 and 7, the arrival at Sinai is seen in Exodus chapter 19, the Leviticus 23 Moedim structure, and the 8th day pattern in Leviticus chapters 8 and 9, Numbers 29, and 2 Chronicles 7. The healing of the man born blind in John chapter 9, verse 14, and the Acts 20 Troas chronology of Paul going from Philippi to Troas, and then the high Sabbath of Passover as found in John chapter 19. And fourthly, we looked at the most common objections: the uninterrupted chain argument, Colossians 2:16, and the complexity objection are all answered by a combination of scriptural evidence, historical scholarship, and the consistent testimony of the Berean pattern. And fifth, we looked at the Jericho account and the Battle of Aphek. Both demonstrate that the new moon interrupts the continuous 7-day count with a 7-day sequence beginning on New Moon Day, resolving on day 7, and the Sabbath falling on day 8. And sixth, we looked at Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur and how there are high Sabbaths by divine declaration, not contradictions to the luni-solar framework, but demonstrations of Yahweh's sovereignty built within it. And then seventh, we looked at the historical record from the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia Biblica, Hutton Webster's book Rest Days, Philo of Alexandria, Scribner's Dictionary of the Bible, and multiple other what we believe to be reputable sources, confirms that the original Hebrew Sabbath was dependent upon the lunar cycle and that its separation from the lunar calendar was a later development by those driven by such as Julius Caesar in 46 BCE and the Bar Kokhba aftermath in 135 and Constantine's 321 edict and the Council of Nicaea in 325. and the Gregorian reform as found in 1582. And finally, we looked at the Gregorian calendar itself as the governing framework of the church life itself. It is a new card, a human, man-made, pagan-named, Roman institutionalized system and never authorized by the word of Yahweh. The testing framework renders its verdict very clearly here. This is not the calendar Yahweh declared for His appointed times. And so the ancient path of Yahweh's timekeeping, it's still written in the heavens. The call still stands to ask for the good way and to walk in it. We have now examined across Teaching 6, parts A, B, C, and D, the Moedim, the luni-solar calendar, and the Sabbath. And so in our next teaching, we're going to turn to another dimension of this same pattern of departure, the question of what Yahweh's Word says about food, about the dietary instructions He gave to His people, and whether those instructions were ever actually set aside for believers under the New Covenant. So Teaching 7 will be the unclean cart, testing the church's rejection of Yahweh's dietary instructions, so make sure you join us for that teaching. Now the series playlist, it's in the description, and until then, keep searching the Scriptures. The ancient paths are always worth finding, friend. And so we've walked a long road together here across these 4 teachings, from the very first verse of Genesis to the prophecies of Daniel, from the manna in the wilderness to the halls of the Council of Nicaea, from the feast of Sukkot in the Gospel of John to the edict of a Roman emperor. We've traced the full story of Yahweh's calendar, its design, its biblical confirmation, its historical preservation, and its systematic replacement by the calendar of Rome. And we've brought the testing framework to bear on all of it. And what you do with what you have heard, that's simply, friend, between you and Yahweh. We're not here to tell you that you must immediately reorganize your life around a calendar the rest of the community does not observe. We're here to say the word of Yahweh is trustworthy. The evidence we believe is real. The ancient path, friend, it's still there, and Yahweh's invitation stands to ask for the good way and to walk in it. And however long that journey takes and whatever it costs you in the cultural accommodation, it's worth it, friend. It's worth it. So thank you, friend, for being a Berean with us. We would just ask that you would subscribe, hit the bell, share this series with someone who is asking the same questions that you are. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. All those links, they are in the description box below. If you prefer to email with more questions or further exploration, you can email us at thebereanway1711@gmail.com. And if you want to support the ministry, we do have a Buy Me Coffee link in the description box below, and just know that every contribution goes directly back into making content like this. And don't forget, Teaching 7 is coming. Don't miss it. Make sure you join us for that. But until next time, friend, be a Berean, walk in the Berean way, and may Yahweh's shalom find you in your pursuit of biblical truth.